You're listening to The Sting of Mortality. Written by M.R.R. Lopez. Chapter 7. A Rusty Nail. The wooden boards creaked as the ship rocked with the waves of the sea. Heavy iron shackles kept Clove's wrists restrained over his head as he sat limp in a cell separated from the others. He noted a few were in a cell like him. The men there looked to be of rough, hardened sorts, with scarred and angled features, and a dark glint of hunger for violence residing in their faces, unlike the wretched masses chained down to the floor. Outside, he could hear the commotion as the slave ship was tied off to the docks. Once secure, the slave traders came down into the cargo hold, rousing the captives with curses and the crack of their whips as they were forced to move in long, interconnected lines. The Clove glanced up at the sound of keys sliding into the iron keyhole. His hackles rose as he prepared to attack the slaver. Unfortunately, he had forgotten how weak he was. When he was unshackled from the beam, he was roughly forced out of the cell and reshackled again to the endless row of slaves. Still regaining his senses, he cursed when he saw the bright morning light as they were forcibly marched out the stinking hold onto the docks. Once his eyes adjusted, his jaws almost dropped at the sight of the spires on the towers that rose up far beyond the city gates. Like cattle to the market, the slaves were led through the gates into its busy streets. The Clove could feel the people stare, feel the shock in their silence. His keen ears heard them gasp, heard them whisper, and the sudden silence fall over their lips as the starved, ragged chain of filth and bondage passed through the city. Fire boiled in his veins. He was proud and refused to be overshadowed like the rest of the slaves. Their heads were bent low, and their eyes seemingly misty and void of spirit, their mind and will broken. But the Clove walked tall, never lowering his fiercely observant yellow eyes. But despite all his pride, despite being a warrior, at the sight of water, he and the wretched slaves bolted toward the water troughs like a bunch of mindless cattle. The Clove shoved his face into the cold waters, guzzling, slurping as much as he could possibly fit into his empty stomach. His sharp ears detected laughter from the guards. No longer blinded by his thirst, he stopped and lifted his head. All along the water trough, the chain stretched with human slaves, bathing in the cool water, lapping it up like dogs. Just like him, just like animals. The feeling that surged through the Clove was beyond words. His throat went tight, but it didn't matter. He had made up his mind. It was time to leave. The Clove's hands fished through his rags, searching for a tiny little sewing kit that he usually kept with him. However, he only found an empty pocket and a large hole that it could have easily fallen out of, or had been confiscated. Much like his boots, the small hidden dagger within it was gone. The Clove cursed under his breath, and his callous hands began scraping on the side of the wooden water trough, searching for a nail loose enough to be able to pry out with his fingers. Unfortunately, he wasn't the first to discover the thin piece of iron protruding from the boards. The Clove's eyes narrowed as he found himself in a sudden grappling match with another set of rough fingers over the same wet, rusted nail. "Find another," growled the opposing captive. The young warrior lifted his head to spot the fair, angled features of a tall male elf hunched over in front of him. The Clove clenched his teeth. "Back off, elf," he cursed. Just as he thought he had won the little finger match, the elf's nimble hands quickly came back and smashed his fingers with a loose cobblestone. Before he could recover, the nail was quickly wriggled free. The arrogant smirk on the elf's lips and the amused chuckle that followed did not sit well with the hot-tempered, yellow-eyed pyro. The slaves cried out in alarm and in protest as Clove flipped the water trough over and leapt over the top. "What's wrong with you? Get off me! Are you insane?" exclaimed the elf in dismay. But after the second fist to the face, he quickly realized the answer was painfully obvious. The sudden commotion quickly caught the attention from the slavers, and they quickly rushed in to pull the Clove off the elf. The Clove spun around, grabbing both coiled whip and keys from the slaver's belt before sweeping the man's feet out from beneath him. Once free, no one was safe from the Clove's scourge. The slavers and slaves alike began to shriek after coming in contact with the long, heavy whip. Just as the slave traders converged around the Clove, he tossed the keys down the line before rushing out to meet the slavers head-on. While many of the now freed slaves ran, stealing whatever they could lay their hands on, while others froze and shrieked in panic. "Idiots!" Jurassic roared as he stepped in to intervene. "Go after them! They're escaping!" he commanded as he unfurled his whip and ended Clove's reign of terror as he lashed Clove's whip out of the air and began to beat Clove down with his wooden club. Clove snarled in pain, but before he could recover, he was slugged hard in the diaphragm. "No one steals from me," Drossik sneered as he continued to buffet Clove. "Get up! I'm going to make an example out of you," he growled. Face bloodied and battered, Clove seethed in pain as he glared up at the man with the club and whip. It was obvious he was being toyed with, and it was time to put the game to an end. The Clove snarled and raised his sword as he had done so many times before. Instead of hacking wildly at the big man wielding the whip and club as all expected, the Clove spun around and hurled a double-edged sword at one of the unsuspecting guards, whom had believed they could merely facilitate the horrible violence from a safe distance. It was a dirty move. Even amongst his own kind, they would have agreed it was less than admirable to break the rule of a fair duel between two men. But it was unexpected, and it worked. The unlucky guard cried out in pain as he fell to the ground, clutching the sword sticking out of his chest as he slowly died. Drossik shouted in outrage, and as planned, he rushed in. The Clove spun around, knocking him off balance with a kick to the shin, and with one practiced fluid motion, the Clove blocked and rolled the club with his left forearm, locking it into place, and stepped in, slamming his open palm into the slaver's nose. The rest of the slavers watched in horror as the young warrior then pivoted around and ruthlessly snapped Drossik's right elbow. The sound of breaking cartilage was sweet music to Clove's ears. Immediately, the big man dropped his club and howled in agony. The plan had worked. The games were all over. The slavers rushed in to put an end to it all before he could do any more damage. Drossik arose from the dirt, seething and cursing in pain as he cradled his fractured arm. "Get your hands off me and bind 'em tight," he commanded. "I'm going to lash the flesh off your back." Drossic laughed. "And then in the morning, when your wound dries out, I'll peel the meat off your bones until you're worth nothing but dog food," he vowed. The Clove retaliated with a vicious, low back kick to Drossic's right kneecap. The sound of cartilage tearing echoed through the air as his right knee buckled. Drossic's face turned ghost white, and he screamed in agony as he fell. Immediately the guards seized hold of the Clove and pulled him away from the whipping post, and a coarse hangman's noose was fastened around his throat. The Clove managed a gruesome chuckle as he turned to look down as the slave ship captain screaming on the floor. "I'm gonna kill all of you," the Clove snarled as he was dragged away from the whipping post to an oak tree nearby. But it was not any ordinary oak tree. This was a hanging tree. Many large buzzards had made their home under the upper branches. Most were so fat it looked as if they might have trouble flying. There was no shortage of corpses to pick from dangling below. The Clove cursed angrily as he was unable to get away, but just as the thick rope around his neck was about to go tight, there was a sudden silence, and the slave traders froze in panic. They all stopped and turned. The Clove looked up. His eyes widened, and his body went stiff as he saw the shades, dressed in black cloaks and armed with the large, broad swords. One particular shade stood out from all the rest. The drawstring to his cloak was a crimson red sash. All the rest looked on and waited for his instructions as he spoke in a hoarse, raspy voice.
"Do you fear death, slave?"
Fowler asked. The Clove clenched his teeth and glanced at the two slavers on either side of him, and the slavers quickly backed away. "I am not a slave," the Clove corrected the shade.
"You aren't free either,"
Fowler responded with a raspy, chortling voice from the putrid-smelling black shroud. The Clove licked his dry lips and swallowed hard. He glanced up at the dark, dirty, bloated feet dangling on either side of him. The shade chuckled coldly as he watched the young warrior evaluate his situation.
"Do you fear death?"
He asked again. The Clove's yellow eyes hardened, and he took in a deep breath. "Death and I are good friends," the Clove shot back darkly. The shade's black teeth curled into a twisted grin beneath its silver mask. "Good to know you haven't lost your spirit," it chortled. "Look, please, I don't know him. This was all his doing," exclaimed the elf beside him. The head shade with the red cord turned away, as if to leave, but just as the Clove thought the slave traders were going to resume the execution, "You will not hang these two. Take the sniveling elf to the cages, and take the troublemaker to the threshing hall. Let us see if he is as fearless as he is capable," he commanded. At once the two subordinate shades stepped silently forward and removed the noose from around their necks, and briskly escorted the troublemakers away from the accursed tree. As much as the Clove wanted to struggle, he was worn out, and the last thing he wanted was any more negative attention, for fear of being recognized. Before long they were separated and hauled off into a large brick structure and locked into individual barred cells. The Clove inspected his prison. It stank, but at least there was a draft from a small iron-barred window. He tested their strength, but the bars held fast, and the walls were made of solid stone. The lock, however, was simple, but he had nothing to pick it with. He moved on and inspected the hinges. He attempted to loosen them, but his efforts were futile. The Clove cursed. If only he had a small knife or a bloody nail, he could be out of the stinking cell in a matter of minutes. He fidgeted with the lock again in desperate hope, but after hours of fruitless labor, the Clove leaned against the cold stone wall and settled down. He was stuck, and there was nothing he could do except for wait. The small, dull, gnawing pain of hunger ate away at him, and the bloody gashes across his back prevented him from falling to sleep. The Clove shut his eyes, oftentimes coming just to the fringes of sleep, but he remained conscious and alert. Clove's sharp ears picked up sounds of the building coming to life. He could feel it too. Barred doors creaked open and slammed shut. Footsteps echoed in the dank stone halls, but he didn't so much as stir. He was tired and embraced the numbness that sleep granted him. The prison guards were close now, disturbing Clove's sedated state, making him acutely aware of the hunger that he couldn't satisfy. The metal door of the Clove's cell squealed open on its rusty hinges. "Come on, get up!" barked a heavy man with a rod and keys in his hands.